Sitting at a worn wooden bar in a dimly lit Memphis cafe, Thomas nursed a lukewarm coffee, trying to blend into the background like he always did. He thought he was invisible, just another face in the crowd. But the moment he muttered a few words about his idol, something shifted. A stranger's eyes lingered on him, sharp and curious, and Thomas felt a strange prickle of anticipation crawl up his spine. He couldn't have known that within hours, the hum of the city, the scent of roasted coffee, and the quiet clatter of dishes would be replaced by flashing lights, pounding music, and a presence so magnetic it made his knees weak. He was about to step from the shadows of admiration into a confrontation with legend itself. Elvis Presley, the man whose voice had haunted his dreams and whose charisma had shaped the soundtrack of his life. And in that fleeting, fragile heartbeat before destiny caught him, Thomas realized that life could change in an instant, and that some encounters are so electrifying they rewrite everything you thought you knew about courage, luck, and fate. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The late spring sun slanted across the streets of Memphis, striking the brick facades of small shops and casting long shadows over the sidewalks that smelled faintly of asphalt, dust, and something sweet from the nearby bakery. In the heart of the city, tucked between a record store and a modest diner, a tiny cafe hummed with the low murmur of conversation, clinking silverware, and the rich, bitter scent of freshly brewed coffee. The ceiling fans turned lazily, cutting through the warmth, their blades scraping softly against the plaster. Thomas Grayson sat alone on a bar stool, a brown leather satchel resting against his legs, his hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug filled with coffee that had gone lukewarm hours ago. Thomas was 34, broad-shouldered, but slightly hunched from years of driving heavy trucks and lifting crates in the logistics warehouse downtown. His hair, once dark and now flecked with gray, was combed neatly, though a few strands always seemed to rebel against discipline. A faded denim jacket covered his work shirt, and scuffed boots rested on the metal footrest, worn soft from the endless steps between warehouse aisles. He had the air of a man used to routine, the kind of quiet strength that went unnoticed by most, except in moments when it mattered. The silent pride in a job well done, the steadfast loyalty to a friend or a memory. Across the cafe, a new manager from the logistics company had entered the room. Jack Abernathy, 28, fresh from a privileged upbringing that smelled of polished shoes and expensive cologne, was already loud enough to fill the small space with his voice. He wore a sharp suit, in an offbeat shade of green that screamed intention, his thin tie knotted too tightly, his hair slicked back with an amount of product that reflected every gleam of sunlight. He laughed, the kind of laugh meant to remind everyone of his presence, and leaned casually against the counter, addressing the scattered employees with pointed remarks about modern music. Thomas sipped his coffee, listening. Jack's words gnawed at the edges of his patience as he dismissed artists who had shaped a generation, whose records had spun on turntables in basements and bedrooms where hopes and dreams collided. Jack was mocking the classics, declaring rock and roll legends as overrated relics of poor marketing and yesterday's fad. He didn't notice, of course, how he pricked thin, invisible nerves in those who held those same songs as lifelines. Thomas felt the heat rise under his collar. He could smell the coffee and faint tobacco lingering in the corners, a reminder of late nights and long drives. The hum of the refrigerator and the quiet hiss of the steam from the coffee machine seemed to fade as he weighed his response. His mind went back to a cramped apartment on Beale Street, to nights spent huddled over a small record player, the needle scratching softly against a black vinyl of Elvis Presley. His father had died suddenly when Thomas was 16, leaving behind debts, grief, and a hollow house. But it was Elvis's voice, the raw, human, trembling yet resolute, that filled the silence, pulling Thomas out of despair, giving him hope he could not yet name. Finally, he spoke. The words were calm, measured, but carried the weight of conviction. "Elvis is my favorite singer," Thomas said, his voice even, but carrying a subtle edge. "No one today comes close to what he did. Not in presence, not in feeling." The cafe seemed to pause, the clinking of spoons halting midair as a few heads turned. Jack's face stiffened, a smirk slowly forming like a blade sliding out of a sheath. "Oh, please," Jack replied, voice sharp as broken glass. "Elvis was a product, nothing more, a gimmick, and you still cling to him like some desperate relic? There's a reason the charts move on, Grayson. Legends die, and we all move forward." Thomas felt the first flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself in months: anger, hot and precise. He gritted his teeth, feeling the years of loyalty, of quiet admiration, of music that had saved him, rise like a shield. "A product? A gimmick?" he said slowly, savoring each word. "Elvis was real. He wasn't selling an image. He was giving people truth. You wouldn't recognize that if it hit you in the face." Jack laughed, a harsh, thin sound that grated against the ears. "And you think holding on to that old vinyl changes anything about your life? You're pathetic, Grayson, clinging to ghosts while the rest of us thrive in reality." The words stung, but Thomas noticed something else. The sudden hush that fell over the cafe as nearby tables turned their heads, curiosity piqued. The sunlight through the dusty window glinted against the rim of his coffee mug, and for a fleeting moment he felt that same surge he had felt as a teenager, discovering the power of a song that made him believe life could be better. A tight knot of resolve formed in his chest. He could let this moment pass, let the world mock him quietly as it had always done. Or he could stand, not for Jack, not for the cafe, but for something far deeper. And as he placed the mug down with a soft thump that seemed to echo, Thomas realized he would not back down. The words had been said, the line drawn. He didn't know yet that this small act of defense, this quiet, personal stand, was about to ripple outward in ways he could never have imagined. Somewhere beyond the streets of Memphis, under the gold and crimson haze of a summer sunset, the universe had started shifting, and a man who had been the soundtrack of Thomas's survival was about to cross paths with him. Thomas pushed back from the stool, adjusting his jacket and straightening his spine. He felt exposed, almost dizzy from the intensity of emotion, but also oddly alive. Jack continued to sneer, oblivious to the storm that had just been unleashed in the heart of a man who had long learned the power of music to shape reality. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, faintly illuminating the cracked sidewalks and the neon of the cafe sign. Inside, the rich scent of coffee mingled with tension and anticipation, as though the air itself knew that today was the first note in a song that would not be easily forgotten. And in that suspended moment, Thomas allowed himself a tiny, secret smile. The world could sneer, the privileged could mock, but something sacred had awakened, and he would follow it, wherever it might lead. The next morning dawned humid and thick with the smell of wet asphalt, the streets of Memphis still glistening from an overnight shower that had left puddles in every uneven crack. Thomas Grayson had hardly slept, his mind running in loops like the grooves of a vinyl record. The cafe confrontation, Jack's cruel words, the bitter edge of embarrassment curling at his stomach. He could hear the faint rumble of freight trucks and the distant wail of a train horn as he walked toward the logistics office, the weight of the previous day pressing on his shoulders. Inside the building, The familiar scent of oil, cardboard, and industrial cleaner greeted him, mingling with the faint aroma of his own coffee-stained jacket. The office hummed with the usual morning energy, telephones ringing, typewriters clacking, and the faint murmurs of colleagues discussing delivery schedules. But something in the atmosphere felt off, tense, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the lingering irritation from yesterday. Thomas approached the reception desk, nodding politely at a clerk, but before he could even set his satchel down, he was summoned. "Grayson," called a voice, crisp, authoritative. Thomas looked up to see Mr. Whitaker, the warehouse supervisor and old friend of Jack's father, standing in the doorway of his office with a forced smile. Behind him, leaning casually against the frame, was Jack, already wearing that same smug expression, as if anticipating the outcome of a game he had already won. Thomas's stomach tightened. Inside the office, the smell of polished wood and stale cigarette smoke wrapped around him. Mr. Whitaker gestured for Thomas to sit. The desk was immaculate, papers stacked neatly in columns, a testament to control, order, and the expectation of obedience. Jack's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, his folded arms accentuating the broad arrogance of his posture. "Thomas," Whitaker began, his voice deceptively calm, "we've received reports regarding your behavior yesterday during lunch. It's been described as disruptive, insubordinate, and frankly, unprofessional." He paused, letting the words sink like stones in a pond. "You are here because, despite your work performance, we cannot tolerate conduct that undermines the team or disrespects management." Thomas's chest tightened. Disruptive? Insubordinate? He had only spoken a few words defending someone who had inspired him his entire life. His mind raced. He recalled the expressions of his colleagues, some subtly amused, some sympathetic, but none had intervened. He wanted to argue, to explain, but the weight of authority in the room pressed down, suffocating. Jack leaned forward slightly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It's simple, Grayson," he said, voice low, sharp. "Some of us understand the world isn't about clinging to nostalgia. You embarrassed yourself, and you embarrassed the company. Mr. Whitaker, I think we both know the best course here." Thomas's heart sank. He understood all too well. Whitaker's next words confirmed it. "Effective immediately, Thomas. Your employment with Grayson Logistics is terminated. This is for the benefit of maintaining harmony within the workplace and preventing further conflict." The world seemed to tilt, the polished wood of the desk blurring as the words settled like a lead weight on his chest. Thomas blinked, not out of surprise. He had expected confrontation, perhaps even reprimand, but out of a deep, piercing sense of injustice. The small office felt suffocating, the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights relentless. His hands trembled slightly as he gathered his belongings. A few personal papers, his lunchbox, a faded photograph of his father tucked into his wallet. Outside the office, the sounds of the warehouse continued as if nothing had happened. Forklifts moved pallets of boxes, employees chatted and laughed, unaware of the quiet humiliation unfolding just beyond the door. Thomas stepped into the hallway, carrying a cardboard box with his personal effects, his knuckles white against the fragile weight. Each step felt heavier than the last, his shoes scraping against the scuffed linoleum with a hollow, echoing sound. As he passed colleagues who glanced at him with polite curiosity, a soft voice broke through the dull clatter. "Thomas," whispered a familiar figure, almost from the shadows. It was Mary, a quiet administrative assistant with a kind face and knowing eyes, her hair pinned back in a simple bun, a streak of sunlight catching the strands. She approached him carefully, her tone low, almost conspiratorial. "You don't even know who's coming to Memphis tomorrow. But this could be your chance." Thomas stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. "My chance," he repeated, his voice hoarse, carrying the faint echo of disbelief. Mary leaned in slightly, glancing over her shoulder to ensure Jack's gaze wasn't following them. "Yes, tomorrow night. Elvis. He's performing right here in the city. My brother works with the team, handling the concert. I can get you a behind-the-scenes look, Thomas. You can see him, really see him, before the crowd. It might lift you." Thomas felt a flicker of light in the shadowed pit of his chest. The sting of humiliation still throbbed, but the possibility of encountering the man who had shaped his life, whose music had given him strength when everything else had crumbled, ignited a spark he had thought extinguished. "Mary, I don't know," he muttered, voice uncertain. "After today, after losing my job." "You've got to trust me," she said gently, her hand brushing briefly against his arm. "Sometimes the world breaks us, Thomas, but moments like this, they can put the pieces back together. You just have to take the first step." Thomas stared down the hallway, listening to the rhythmic clatter of the warehouse, the distant hum of the air conditioning, the muted conversations. He remembered his father's laughter, the evenings with a record player spinning endlessly, the way Elvis's voice seemed to speak directly into his soul. And in that memory, the grief, anger, and embarrassment melted just enough for a fragile sense of hope to emerge. By the time he reached the doors of the office, the late morning sun was casting long shadows across the parking lot, the heat of the day beginning to rise. Thomas adjusted his jacket, straightened his posture, and inhaled deeply, tasting the sharp, slightly metallic scent of the city air. He did not yet know how the following 24 hours would change him, how a single act of courage, defending a singer, a voice that had carried him through loss, had already set in motion events far beyond his imagination. Mary's words echoed in his mind. "It might lift you." And for the first time that day, Thomas allowed himself to believe that the universe was aligning, that perhaps the humiliation of today was merely the prelude to something extraordinary. He looked at the sky above the rooftops, the clouds tinged with the faintest hint of sunset, even though it was still morning, and felt a tremor of anticipation. The injustice had burned, sharp and real, but now it had a counterweight, a possibility, fragile yet undeniable, that tomorrow could be the day his life would shift in ways he could barely imagine. The following evening arrived with a sticky warmth that clung to Memphis like a second skin, the streets shimmering under the yellow glare of streetlights reflecting on the rain-slick asphalt. Thomas walked slowly, each step echoing in the hollow rhythm of the alleyways that led toward the concert hall. His mind churned in a mixture of anxiety and anticipation, the sting of his dismissal still lingering like a bruise. But beneath it, an unfamiliar pulse of excitement thrummed. Mary had promised him access behind the scenes of Elvis's show, a chance he had never dreamed of, but now that it loomed, the reality seemed almost unreal. Mary met him at the side entrance of the venue, her figure silhouetted against the glowing marquee that proclaimed Elvis Presley live in Memphis. Her eyes, glinting with excitement, met his. "You ready?" she asked, her voice low, cautious yet electric. Thomas nodded, swallowing hard. He could feel his pulse in his throat, and the old familiar thrill of anticipation made his palms sweat. As they passed the loading docks, the scene was chaotic yet strangely hypnotic. Roadies and stage hands moved with precise urgency, hauling speakers and amplifiers as thick cables snaked across the concrete like black rivers. The smell of hot tar from the parking lot blended with the metallic tang of equipment, and the faint scent of grease and sweat hovered in the air, a testament to the intense physical labor that made such shows possible. Thomas marveled at it all, the sheer scale, the organized chaos, and felt the creeping tension of disbelief. He was actually here. Mary led him past the throng of musicians tuning their instruments, backing vocalists warming up their voices in quiet harmonies, and dancers stretching limber bodies that seemed too perfect to be human. Every detail seemed amplified. The glint of stage lights bouncing off sequined jackets, the low hum of sound checks vibrating through the floor, the sharp scent of hairspray mixed with the lingering aroma of tobacco smoke. Thomas's chest tightened as he realized he could hear the faint echoes of Elvis's voice through the thick curtain of backstage walls. A shiver ran down his spine. "You'll have to stay quiet," Mary whispered, glancing around as a pair of roadies wheeled a drum kit past them. "He's in rehearsal, but you'll hear him. Really hear him, Thomas." Thomas followed her through narrow corridors that smelled of damp concrete and old paint, each turn bringing him closer to the heartbeat of the show. Then they arrived at the small doorway where a faintly familiar melody floated out, cutting through the backstage hum like sunlight-piercing clouds. It was Elvis, adjusting his microphone, humming softly as he tested levels, his voice rich and effortless, carrying warmth that seemed to wrap around Thomas's soul. Every note struck a chord deep within him, igniting memories he had buried. Afternoons spinning records with his father, the solace of music after grief, the comfort of a voice that had once saved him from despair. Thomas's heart raced. He could feel the edges of his stress and humiliation from the previous day dissolving, replaced by a tidal wave of awe. The man who had inspired him all these years was here, alive, breathing the same air, making music with a vitality that no recording could capture. The reality was overwhelming. He was not just a fan, he was a witness. Yet even in this moment of transcendence, Thomas could not shake the undercurrent of tension. As he leaned closer to the doorway, his eyes caught a familiar figure moving with casual confidence near the VIP entrance. Jack. The same smug grin, the same air of entitlement. Jack waved to a manager, joking loudly, as if the world itself conspired to place him in the center of attention. The sight made Thomas's stomach twist. After everything yesterday, seeing Jack here, thriving in a world he had just been barred from, ignited a spark of anger he could not contain. "Don't even think about it," Mary hissed, sensing the tension radiating from him. "Focus. You're here for one thing. Him." Thomas forced himself to exhale, pushing the anger aside, though it lingered like smoke at the edges of his mind. Mary gently guided him toward a small observation window overlooking the stage, where the full scope of the concert preparations unfolded. Technicians adjusted spotlights, the brass section ran through a warm-up, and the rhythm guitarist tapped lightly on his instrument, setting a pulse that seemed almost in sync with Thomas's heartbeat. The room vibrated with the anticipation of creation, the final moments before the storm of music would hit the audience. And Thomas felt a strange kinship with everyone involved. Through a slit in the curtain, he caught his first full glimpse of Elvis, moving effortlessly across the stage, checking monitors, adjusting microphones. There was an intensity in his eyes, a quiet concentration that belied the electric charisma he exuded in performance. The contrast was striking, the man's private diligence versus the mythic energy the public would soon witness. Thomas found himself holding his breath as Elvis began to sing, softly at first, letting the notes ripple into the room like liquid gold. every fiber of Thomas's being resonated with the sound. The pain of yesterday, the unfair dismissal, the sense of being small and insignificant in the vast machinery of corporate hierarchy, everything was eclipsed by the raw beauty and immediacy of this moment. He realized that this experience, fleeting as it might be, was a gift, a reminder that greatness could exist in both art and life, that inspiration could strike even when the world seemed determined to humiliate and diminish. Mary leaned closer, whispering, "Tomorrow, you'll be in the audience. But tonight is just for you." Thomas nodded, unable to speak, letting the music flood him completely. The tremor of anxiety was gone, replaced by a sense of possibility he had not dared to feel since childhood. The injustice of the morning no longer seemed like an endpoint, but a prelude, a necessary darkness before the arrival of light. He lingered in that suspended state, listening to Elvis's voice, absorbing the intricate choreography of movement and sound, and allowing himself to imagine a life in which passion and courage could intersect. And then, in a brief, almost imperceptible pause between notes, he felt a rush of certainty. Tomorrow, he would be there, not as a mere observer, but as a participant in the shared magic of music. Jack remained in the periphery, a shadow Thomas could not ignore, but he felt no fear. He had glimpsed the true center of the universe tonight, and the petty provocations of a man like Jack mattered far less in comparison. The possibilities ahead shimmered with potential, each note of Elvis's rehearsal music echoing like a promise that life could still surprise, even after disappointment and injustice. As they slipped quietly out of the backstage corridor, Thomas felt a surge of resolve. He would be there tomorrow, and when the moment came, he would step forward. Not as a timid fan, not as a defeated employee, but as someone who had been given a rare chance to confront wonder itself. And in that anticipation, he found something more valuable than revenge, more urgent than resentment. A purpose renewed, a heart reignited, and the first tangible hint that the course of his life might yet bend toward something extraordinary. The next afternoon, the air outside the concert venue was thick and almost suffocating, the summer sun reflecting off the asphalt and sending waves of heat through the throngs of early arrivals. Thomas arrived with Mary at his side, the pulse of nervous excitement still lingering from the previous night's rehearsal. His stomach churned, not from anxiety about the concert itself, but from the uneasy awareness that Jack was likely inside, flaunting privileges Thomas had been denied. They approached the service entrance, where a small group of staff and crew milled about, laughing and carrying equipment cases. Thomas's attention immediately went to Jack, standing near the edge of the crowd with that infuriatingly confident grin. He was dressed in a cream-colored suit that seemed to reflect sunlight and arrogance in equal measure, his cufflinks glinting as he gestured animatedly to a stage manager. The casual familiarity in Jack's posture suggested he owned the place. The sight made Thomas's jaw tighten involuntarily. "Ignore him," Mary murmured, sensing the tension radiating from Thomas. But he found it impossible. Jack's very presence was a provocation, a reminder of the humiliation he had suffered just a day earlier. The manager Jack was speaking to laughed at something he said, a low, indulgent chuckle, and Thomas felt the old anger surge up again. Every nerve in his body seemed to bristle. "Even after yesterday," Jack called out suddenly, catching Thomas's gaze, his tone laced with mockery. "You're here. Guess you think seeing Elvis will somehow make up for being, dismissed?" The words hit like ice water, sharp and deliberate, designed to sting. Thomas felt the familiar constriction in his chest, the old surge of helplessness and rage rising to the surface. Thomas opened his mouth, ready to retort, but Mary grabbed his arm with a firm, almost desperate grip. "Not now," she whispered. "Trust me." Her eyes held a mix of urgency and empathy. Thomas forced himself to step back, swallowing the bitter lump in his throat, and allowed her to steer him toward a narrow corridor that led to the backstage area. Every step felt like leaving a battlefield, the tension of confrontation lingering behind them like a shadow. Once they were out of sight, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The narrow hallway smelled of varnish and old wood, a stark contrast to the sticky heat outside and the metallic tang of the loading dock. The faint thrum of sound checks reached them through the walls, a low, steady rhythm that seemed to echo the pounding of Thomas's heart. Mary opened a side door, and suddenly Thomas was enveloped in a space that felt almost sacred, behind the curtains, where the concert's energy was being cultivated. Inside, the room was alive with movement. Backing vocalists tuned their voices, rehearsing scales in quiet, precise bursts. Technicians adjusted lighting, their hands flying over controls with practiced ease. The faint scent of hairspray, sweat, and wood polish mingled in the air. Thomas's eyes widened as he took it all in. Every detail, from the flickering of stage lights to the shimmer of sequined costumes laid out on racks, was vivid, immediate, and intoxicating. Then he heard it, a voice, unmistakable, smooth yet commanding, filling the space with a resonance that bypassed his ears and settled deep in his chest. Elvis. He was singing, softly, almost casually, running through the lines of a song, testing microphone levels. The voice was alive, imperfectly perfect, each note tinged with emotion that no record could capture. Thomas felt his tension melt, replaced by awe and a kind of reverent disbelief. For the first time in hours, he forgot Jack, his anger dissipating in the face of something transcendent. He moved closer, drawn by the sound, peering through a narrow gap in the curtain. Elvis's presence dominated the room, not just physically, but in the way he carried himself. Every movement deliberate, every gesture filled with energy and focus. The drummer tapped a soft rhythm. The bassist adjusted his lines, and the small group of musicians synced seamlessly, creating an intricate tapestry of sound that made Thomas's chest tighten with emotion. The music was alive, breathing in the space around him, and he was part of its silent audience. Mary leaned close again. "See? This is what matters. Don't waste it on Jack. He's just noise." Thomas nodded, swallowing hard, letting the words sink in. The juxtaposition of the two worlds, the petty malice of Jack versus the life-affirming energy of the concert, was almost unbearable in its clarity. He realized, with a mixture of relief and exhilaration, that his real conflict was no longer with Jack. It was with himself. Could he let this moment, this rare glimpse of pure artistry, define him rather than the injustice of the morning? He lingered quietly, absorbing every nuance, the glint of sweat on a guitarist's forehead under the harsh stage lights, the quick adjustments of a microphone stand, the soft harmonies that overlapped with Elvis's voice in perfect, unplanned alignment. The sound wrapped around him, and he felt his heartbeat slow, syncing with the rhythm, his previous fury melting into anticipation and awe. Then, from the corner of his eye, he caught the flash of Jack again, briefly, unmistakably, lingering near the VIP entrance. Thomas clenched his fists inside his pockets, not out of rage this time, but in a physical grounding, a reminder to stay present. Jack was still a shadow in his periphery, a lingering echo of yesterday's humiliation, but Thomas no longer felt powerless. The music had shifted something inside him. The anger was now fuel, a quiet determination to not let any obstacle, any arrogant man, prevent him from experiencing this moment fully. Mary nudged him gently toward the far side of the room, toward the space just behind the stage. "You're ready," she whispered. "Soon, it'll be more than just watching. You'll be there. You'll see him. For real." Thomas nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. For the first time in nearly 24 hours, he felt hope. The thrilling, almost frightening kind that told him something remarkable was about to happen. And as Elvis's voice swelled, resonating against the walls, Thomas allowed himself to imagine what it would feel like tomorrow. To be in the audience, to be noticed, to step beyond the shadows of dismissal, and into a moment that might, just might, change everything. The arena was a living entity, pulsating with anticipation as the crowd surged forward, filling every available seat, spilling over the aisles, and humming with an electric energy that could have been felt in the bones. Thomas stood just off to the side of the stage, his heart pounding so loudly he feared it might drown out the faint tuning of instruments in the background. The air smelled of sweat, popcorn, and varnished wood, mingling with the faint metallic tang from the stage lights. He gripped the edge of a support beam, trying to anchor himself to the present moment. And yet, he felt as though he were floating on a current of expectation. The opening chords of the first song struck like a lightning bolt, and the arena erupted. Fans waved their hands, some crying, others singing along word for word. The sound was overwhelming, a tidal wave of devotion and adrenaline. And then he saw him, Elvis. He stepped onto the stage, every movement smooth yet commanding, the sequins on his white jumpsuit catching the lights and scattering them in sharp, dazzling beams across the crowd. Thomas's throat went dry, and he had to remind himself to breathe. From the moment the first notes of the guitar rang out, Thomas was mesmerized. He watched as Elvis's voice cut through the air, warm and powerful, filling the arena with a presence that transcended mere sound. The audience responded in kind, a chorus of clapping, shouting, and singing, their energy feeding back into him, vibrating through the floor and up into his chest. And then, as if by some improbable magic, their eyes met. For a fleeting second, Elvis's gaze locked onto Thomas, sharp and discerning, and Thomas felt an almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it carried weight beyond measure, a quiet acknowledgement that cut through all the doubt, fear, and humiliation he had carried with him. The warmth of that recognition made his chest tighten, and his mind swirled with disbelief. Was it possible? Could a mere nod from a man he had admired for decades carry the gravity it did? He wanted to shout, to laugh, to cry. Yet he remained frozen, rooted in the mixture of awe and gratitude that only a lifetime of suppressed reverence could summon. Elvis spoke into the microphone during a brief pause, his voice steady but charged with an almost spiritual authority. "Sometimes," he said, scanning the audience with eyes that seemed to see everything and everyone, "we find ourselves in situations where we are underestimated, dismissed, or even cast aside. But never forget the value of staying true to who you are, even when it feels like the world has turned against you." Thomas's pulse quickened, and he felt a strange, private resonance within him. The words landed like arrows aimed with precision, not at the crowd, not at the general public, but somehow, inexplicably, at him. He knew, without question, that they were meant for him. The moment was intimate, despite the thousands around him, and it filled the empty spaces that Jack's scorn had left behind. From the side of the stage, Thomas caught sight of Jack once again. He was still attempting to project ease and superiority, laughing at something one of the VIPs said, oblivious to the effect Elvis's words might have had. but for a fleeting instant, their eyes met. Elvis's gaze sharpened, and for the first time, Jack's smugness wavered. There was a quiet authority in that look, a calm, assessing judgment that seemed to measure arrogance against merit, ego against authenticity. Thomas felt a thrill of vindication, though he knew better than to let it dominate him. The moment belonged to something far larger than petty rivalry. The crowd's energy built again, a collective roar that rose and fell like waves, and Thomas felt it reverberate inside him. He was no longer just an observer. He was part of the living, breathing entity that filled the arena. Every clap, every cheer, every note carried him forward, tethering him to the music, to the moment, and to something he could barely name, but felt deeply: belonging, recognition, and the strange, exhilarating possibility of change. As Elvis transitioned seamlessly into the next song, his voice soaring over the instruments, Thomas let himself be carried away. He realized he had not thought about the job, about Jack, about any of the petty humiliations that had plagued him since yesterday. Instead, he focused entirely on the power of the music, on the immediacy of the moment, and on the simple, unalterable fact that he was witnessing the man who had shaped his childhood, his dreams, and even his courage to stand up for what he loved. Mary's presence beside him was grounding. She leaned in, whispering, "This is just the beginning." And Thomas nodded, a shiver of anticipation traveling down his spine. The universe, it seemed, had conspired to place him here, at the intersection of years of quiet devotion and a living legend whose voice had become the soundtrack of his resilience. Every fiber of him vibrated with a singular certainty. Nothing, not even the cruelty of yesterday or the arrogance of Jack, could diminish the enormity of this experience. And in that suspended, incandescent moment, Thomas understood something profound. It was not just the music, nor even the proximity to the man himself. It was the recognition, the acknowledgement of his own fidelity, his own enduring love for something that had guided him through the darkest moments. Elvis, perhaps unknowingly, had created a bridge for him to cross from humiliation to empowerment, from doubt to affirmation. The thrill of being noticed, of being seen without pretense, filled Thomas with a quiet, awe-struck clarity. As the final notes of the song echoed into the rafters, Thomas exhaled slowly, feeling the collective energy of the arena settle around him like a protective cloak. He had arrived at a threshold, standing on the edge of something transformative, yet he did not know exactly how the next step would unfold. But one truth was unmistakable. This night would forever mark the point where admiration became something more active, more present, and far more transformative than he had ever imagined possible. The lights on the stage dimmed briefly, then flared again, sending shafts of gold and white cutting across the audience. The roar of applause from the final song still lingered, echoing off the rafters like distant thunder. Thomas, who had been leaning against the side of the stage, suddenly felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned slightly to see Mary, her eyes wide, a barely contained grin tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Go," she whispered urgently, shoving him gently forward. "Now, he means you." Thomas froze, disbelief rooting him to the floor. His mind raced, tripping over 100 reasons not to move. The humiliation of being exposed, the lingering sting of his recent firing, the sheer improbability of being singled out by Elvis himself. But before he could formulate a single excuse, the crowd's cheer swelled once more, as though urging him forward, and he found his legs moving almost of their own accord. The stage seemed impossibly high, each step echoing in the cavernous arena. As he reached the center, The audience erupted into applause again, and Thomas felt the heat of 1,000 eyes on him. His palms were clammy, his pulse a frantic drumbeat in his ears. He looked up, and there was Elvis, standing in the spotlight, an effortless calm radiating from him as he gestured with a hand toward the microphone. The world seemed to shrink to this single point of focus, the noise and chaos reduced to a blur at the edges of Thomas's vision. "You," Elvis said, his voice cutting through the applause. "Come here." The words, simple as they were, carried a weight Thomas could not have imagined. He stepped closer, each movement a battle against trembling limbs. The microphone hovered just in front of him, cool metal against his palms, and he stared out at the audience, their faces a blur of eager anticipation. The cheers were louder now, insistent, almost demanding. And then, as if testing him, Elvis began the song they had rehearsed in part only minutes ago. The first few notes rose, and Thomas's voice trembled instinctively, betraying every ounce of fear he had tried to suppress. The sound was raw, unpolished, yet entirely his own. A ripple of approval passed through the crowd, encouraging him to continue. He swallowed hard, grounding himself with a breath, and began to follow the melody with more confidence. Each word, each note, felt like a declaration, a reclamation of dignity that had been stripped from him only days before. Behind him, Elvis watched with an intensity that was both comforting and electrifying. Then, with a subtle gesture, a tilt of his head, the slight lift of a hand, he signaled the orchestra to join in. The music swelled around Thomas, surrounding him like a tide, and he felt himself being lifted, carried by the harmony of instruments, lights, and voices. The audience responded instantly, their applause mingling with the rising crescendo, forming a cocoon of energy that made the impossible feel achievable. As the song progressed, Thomas's initial hesitation transformed into a growing certainty. He no longer doubted himself, no longer feared the judgment of the thousands of eyes upon him. Each note became an affirmation, each line a testament to the resilience he had cultivated through years of quiet perseverance. He glanced at Elvis, who was now leaning in slightly, matching his phrasing, weaving the duet seamlessly, allowing Thomas to shine without overshadowing him. From across the stage, Thomas noticed Jack. His expression was a mixture of disbelief and anger, his earlier arrogance dissolving in real time as he saw the audience responding with enthusiasm not to the star alone, but to the quiet, unassuming man who had been dismissed and belittled only hours before. Jack's lips pressed into a thin line, a silent acknowledgement that the tables had turned, though he dared not voice it aloud. Thomas's voice strengthened with every line, the tremor fading into a steady confidence he hadn't realized he possessed. The orchestra swelled, the audience clapping in rhythm, creating a sensation of unity and momentum that was almost overwhelming. Mary's smile from the wings reminded him of the serendipity that had brought him here, and the thought steeled his nerves. He wasn't just singing, he was asserting the validity of his passion, the legitimacy of his devotion, and the undeniable truth that love for music, even music considered old-fashioned, was timeless. As the final notes approached, Elvis leaned closer, harmonizing flawlessly with Thomas. Their voices intertwined, forming a singular moment of musical transcendence that resonated through the hall, leaving no room for doubt, no trace of humiliation, only raw, shared exultation. The crowd's ovation reached a fever pitch, a roaring affirmation that this unexpected, vulnerable duet had transformed the arena into a crucible of collective emotion. In that instant, Thomas felt a profound shift inside himself. The fear that had clung to him like a second skin for years melted away. The recent insult, the firing, Jack's ridicule, They all became distant echoes, powerless against the living affirmation of the moment. He realized, in the fullness of his being, that he had not only survived this challenge, but had stepped into something greater: recognition, connection, and the validation of being true to himself, no matter the cost. As the last chord rang out, and the audience erupted again, Thomas's eyes met Elvis's one more time. There was a brief, unspoken exchange, a nod, a small, almost imperceptible smile, and Thomas knew he had been seen, truly seen. Not as an employee, not as a fan, not as a man recently wronged, but as someone worthy of acknowledgement, someone capable of standing tall in the presence of a legend. The lights softened, the applause washing over him like a wave, and Thomas exhaled fully for the first time in days, the tremor in his chest replaced by a steady, soaring pride. Somewhere in the noise, somewhere in the chaos of celebration, he realized that life had shifted on its axis. He had stepped into a new orbit, one where courage, passion, and authenticity could collide with chance and create a moment of extraordinary possibility. The roar of applause subsided into a hushed expectancy, a collective inhale that seemed to ripple through the arena like a held breath. Thomas, still trembling slightly from the exhilaration of the duet, felt Elvis's hand on his shoulder, warm, steady, reassuring. The pressure of the moment didn't crush him. Instead, it lent gravity to every sensation. He could feel the intensity of the lights, the heat from the stage lamps, the faint vibrations of the sound system under his feet. The arena felt less like a hall and more like a living organism, waiting to exhale in response to what was about to come. Elvis leaned into the microphone, his voice calm but commanding, carrying effortlessly over the remaining hum of anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone slow, deliberate, drawing the crowd into a web of attention. "Tonight, I met someone very special." There was a pause, the kind that holds time in suspension, allowing every ear to catch the next words in perfect clarity. Thomas's stomach twisted nervously. "I met a man," Elvis continued, "who faced humiliation not because he failed, not because he lacked talent, but simply because he dared to love the music that speaks to his soul." Thomas felt the words as though they were directed straight into him. Every past insult, every sting of dismissal, seemed to vibrate in the resonance of that declaration. The audience responded with a murmur of curiosity, a wave of expectancy that rolled through the crowd, teasing the tension until it could no longer be contained. Elvis's gaze swept across the sea of faces before returning to Thomas. The warmth in his eyes was impossible to misinterpret. He saw him. Every line of worry, every shadow of self-doubt, every tiny fracture of insecurity was acknowledged, yet not condemned. Instead, there was recognition, validation. And then, with a subtle shift, Elvis's voice rose, carrying authority and gravitas. "In a world quick to judge, quick to dismiss, quick to belittle those who simply remain true to themselves, it takes courage to stand firm in your passion." Thomas's chest swelled involuntarily. The words were heavy with meaning, but also liberating, as if a weight he hadn't realized he carried had been lifted. He glanced at the audience and noticed a collective leaning forward, eyes wide, breaths caught in their throats. There was a shared understanding here, a communion of empathy and admiration. People weren't merely applauding a performance, they were witnessing something authentic, a public acknowledgement of resilience and integrity. Elvis took a small step closer, his hand still resting lightly on Thomas's shoulder, anchoring him in the spotlight. "And tonight," he said, pausing for effect, I want to honor that courage." His voice dropped slightly, intimate yet resonant, pulling the audience into a shared secret. This man, right here, he's an example of what it means to hold on to your truth, even when the world tells you otherwise, to stand tall when others try to bring you down. The arena was silent now, a collective gasp almost palpable. Thomas's heart thumped so loudly he thought the crowd might hear it. He felt the tears prickling, unbidden, but he did not wipe them away. To do so would have been to diminish the raw, incandescent power of the moment. Every face in the crowd, strangers, friends, fans of music long past their prime, were fully present, drinking in the spectacle of recognition and validation. Then, with a deliberate sweep of his eyes, Elvis glanced toward Jack. The young man stood frozen near the side of the stage. His earlier confidence evaporated into something thinner, sharper, a mixture of disbelief, shame, and awe. Elvis's gaze, calm but unflinching, communicated what no words could fully capture, that arrogance and cruelty could not endure in the presence of authenticity and courage. The audience, sensing the silent confrontation, shifted in anticipation. The tension was palpable, a living thing threading through the hall. "Let this be a reminder," Elvis said, raising his voice so that every corner of the arena caught the resonance, "that no one has the right to take away your pride, your love, your heart. Never let fear or scorn silence the music inside you." The crowd erupted into a thunderous ovation, a wave of sound and energy that enveloped Thomas completely. He could barely breathe, the intensity of the recognition both overwhelming and exhilarating. Elvis released his shoulder from Thomas, yet the connection lingered, electric and affirming. He gestured toward the audience, who continued to cheer and clap, many standing now, their eyes bright with admiration and solidarity. Thomas realized that the applause was not just for him. It was for anyone who had ever felt belittled for their passions, anyone who had been dismissed for daring to follow their heart. The hall had become a living testament to human resilience, and he was at the center of it, simultaneously humbled and elevated. As the ovation reached its zenith, Thomas's gaze met Elvis's once more. There was a quiet, almost imperceptible nod, a seal of approval, a promise of acknowledgement that transcended the spectacle of the stage. In that instant, Thomas understood the truth of the experience. This was not merely a performance, not simply an honor. It was a profound lesson in courage, in dignity, and in the transformative power of recognition. Even as the crowd's applause began to fade, the echo of the moment lingered. Thomas felt it deep in his chest, a resonance that would outlast every external cheer or accolade. The affirmation of his worth, the acknowledgement of his steadfastness, was now embedded in the fabric of the arena, in the collective memory of everyone present, and most importantly, within himself. The arena was still vibrating from the applause, yet in the eye of the storm, Thomas felt a quiet, almost surreal clarity. Elvis's gaze lingered on him, soft but intensely deliberate, as if measuring the exact weight of every thought, every doubt, every small act of courage that had led Thomas here. The hand that had been on his shoulder now gently lifted the microphone toward him, an invitation and a challenge rolled into one. The roar of the crowd faded into a distant hum, leaving only the warmth and presence of the music and the man who had inspired him since childhood. "Son," Elvis's voice resonated, calm but penetrating, "never apologize for the music that speaks to your heart." The words, though simple, struck like a bell through Thomas's chest. He felt the tremor of a long-suppressed self-doubt loosen its grip, scattering like dust in sunlight. The audience leaned in collectively, sensing the intimacy of the moment. the rare, personal connection between the icon on stage and the man beside him. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion, realizing that the advice was both a blessing and a liberation. Every reprimand, every humiliation, every sneer he had endured seemed to dissolve under the force of those words. Elvis didn't pause, instead allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to draw every listener into the suspense. Then, in a voice that carried authority and warmth, he continued, "Tonight, I want you to lead. Let the song be yours. I'll follow your voice. You show us all what it means to stand unafraid, to honor your passion, and to embrace the music that defines you." The crowd erupted into murmurs of astonishment, some clapping, some cheering, all aware that what was unfolding was no ordinary performance. It was a sacred transfer of trust, a sharing of something deeply human. Thomas hesitated for a heartbeat, staring at the microphone as if it were a bridge to another world. His fingers trembled slightly, brushing against the cool metal, and he could feel the sweat beading on his palms. Memories of the last few days, the humiliation, the confrontation, the strange, sudden access to backstage, flashed vividly. Each moment had led him here, to a precarious precipice between fear and exhilaration. He inhaled deeply, centering himself, feeling the energy of the arena pulsating beneath his feet. Then, with a quiet exhale, he began to sing. The first notes were shaky, a fragile thread of sound barely holding together, but the audience caught it immediately. There was no judgment, only support. A shared recognition of vulnerability turned into courage. A wave of warmth passed through Thomas as he felt his voice growing steadier, stronger, intertwining with the subtle harmony of Elvis's guiding presence. The music swelled, filling the arena with layers of sound, the soft support of the orchestra, the echo of Elvis's understated harmonies, the collective heartbeat of the crowd. Every note felt like a defiance of the doubt that had haunted him, a declaration that he belonged not just in the audience, but on this stage, alive in this moment. The interplay between them grew naturally, Elvis subtly yielding the melody, letting Thomas take the lead while weaving his own lines around him. It was no longer just a duet. It was a conversation, a dialogue of courage and acknowledgement. The crowd responded in real time, clapping, swaying, voices raised in unison during the chorus. Each cheer, each clap, each collective breath reinforced Thomas's growing confidence, creating a feedback loop of empowerment that seemed to suspend reality. The young man who had mocked him days ago, Jack, stood frozen near the side of the stage, his expression a mixture of disbelief and silent concession. He had been confronted not with anger, but with undeniable proof of character and talent. The song reached its climactic lines, and the arena felt as though it was holding itself together solely to witness the final notes. Thomas's voice, once hesitant, now rang clear and commanding, carrying both emotion and authority. Elvis harmonized seamlessly, not overpowering, but amplifying the power of the moment, giving the duet a depth that resonated far beyond the music. Every heart in the arena seemed to synchronize with the rhythm, the swelling crescendo forging a sense of unity that transcended mere performance. As the final note lingered and faded into a suspended silence, the audience erupted into a deafening ovation, their energy spilling over like a river breaking through a dam. Thomas felt his knees weaken, his chest tight with emotion, yet he held the microphone firmly, basking in the validation of 1,000 eyes and voices. Elvis's hand returned to his shoulder, a grounding force, a reminder that this victory was both shared and personal. The warmth in the gesture communicated something deeper than applause or fame. It was recognition, mentorship, and solidarity. In that instant, Thomas understood fully the gravity of what had transpired. He had transformed from a timid admirer into a participant, a voice lifted not only in song but in defiance of every obstacle that had stood before him. He had claimed his place not by fighting, not by arguing, but by embracing authenticity, passion, and courage. The energy in the arena was contagious, and Thomas, soaked in it, realized he would carry this feeling, this moment, for the rest of his life. A beacon of resilience, a reminder that the right words at the right time could indeed change everything. The applause continued to thunder through the arena, but Thomas felt a strange stillness amidst the chaos, a private bubble of triumph and disbelief that no amount of cheering could penetrate. Elvis, still holding his shoulder, leaned in closer, whispering something over the residual hum of the crowd. "Meet me backstage after the show," he said softly, with that familiar twinkle of mischief and warmth in his eyes. That small invitation, delivered with an effortless grace, made Thomas's heart skip in a way he hadn't felt since childhood, back when he had first pressed the needle to the vinyl, letting the crackling notes of a distant voice comfort him in lonely rooms. The lights dimmed slightly as the crew prepared for the evening's finale. Thomas, still trembling from the intensity of his performance, was guided carefully by Elvis toward the side of the stage. Behind the curtain, the air was heavy with the scent of sweat, hot lights, and the faint tang of perfume lingering from fans who had pressed too close during the earlier performance. Musicians were tuning their instruments, adjusting straps, and sharing quiet laughter, while stagehands moved equipment with the precision of a choreographed ballet. In the midst of this controlled chaos, Thomas felt like he had crossed an invisible threshold, not just into a backstage area, but into a completely new chapter of his life. Elvis reached for a small, neatly folded handkerchief on a nearby table. He signed it with a flourish of his pen, the ink still wet, and then turned toward Thomas. "Here," he said, placing it gently in his hands. The fabric was soft and warm, imbued with the subtle scent of Elvis himself, cologne, sweat, and the faint aroma of stage lights. Holding it, Thomas could barely speak. The symbolic weight of the gesture made him feel both honored and unexpectedly exposed. It was more than a souvenir. It was an acknowledgement of the journey he had endured, the humility he had maintained, and the courage he had finally claimed. "You've got a gift," Elvis continued, his voice low but firm, "and not just for singing. You understand what it means to truly stand for something that matters to you, even when the world doubts you." Thomas's eyes widened, swallowing the lump in his throat. The words resonated deeper than any applause ever could, affirming every quiet struggle, every sleepless night, every moment he had felt unseen or dismissed. For once, he was visible, not just as a fan, not just as a man in the crowd, but as someone whose dedication and authenticity were acknowledged by the very person who had inspired it. Elvis motioned toward the orchestra pit. "If you want, you can help me for the next few shows. Just a hand, maybe a voice, maybe more. But mostly, be here." Thomas nodded, too stunned for words, feeling the gravity of what had been offered. It was an invitation into a living, breathing world he had only ever glimpsed from afar. Each beat of his heart seemed to echo the rhythm of the arena itself, synchronizing his newfound resolve with the energy of music, people, and unspoken possibility. As Thomas stepped out from behind the curtain and into the cool night air outside the arena, he carried the handkerchief carefully, almost reverently, pressing it to his chest. The evening sky was darkening into a deep indigo, speckled with the first few stars, but it felt alive, luminous, as if reflecting the triumph that still radiated through him. Fans lingered outside, their voices a distant hum, while the faint scent of asphalt warmed by the day's sun mingled with the cool breeze. He realized he was no longer merely a spectator of life. He had become a participant, a man who had confronted fear, humiliation, and doubt, and emerged transformed. The city around him hummed with the gentle chaos of Memphis nightlife. Cars sputtered along the streets, neon signs flickered with intermittent intensity, and the faint strains of music drifted from a nearby bar. Yet, within that ordinary evening, Thomas felt an extraordinary shift. He was no longer defined by past failures, by the sneers of those like Jack, or even by the cautious life he had once led. He had stepped into the light, both literally and figuratively, claiming a space that belonged to authenticity, courage, and passion. As he turned to glance back at the arena, he caught a fleeting silhouette through the glass. Elvis, still on stage, waving a hand in quiet acknowledgement. Thomas smiled, feeling the culmination of every hope, every dream, and every silent prayer from his youth resonate in that singular moment. The crowd outside continued to cheer, but for him, the world had already shifted. He was carrying with him not just the handkerchief, not just the applause, but a deep, unshakable sense that his life had irrevocably changed. He would never forget the night when music, courage, and human connection converged into an experience so profound that it would shape the rest of his days. For the first time in his life, Thomas allowed himself to fully believe that miracles, quiet, unassuming, and entirely earned, could happen. That belief carried him down the street, into the warm night, toward a future that shimmered with potential, under a sky that seemed, for a brief, perfect moment, as infinite as his newfound courage. The world felt wider, richer, and impossibly full of promise, and he knew, without a doubt, that nothing, not even the small sneering voices of doubt, could ever take this night from him. It belonged wholly to him, to the music he loved, and to the man who had recognized him for who he truly was.